Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, your award-winning Texas history podcast. I'm your host, Ken Wise. I appreciate you very much tuning in today for a little Texas history. This podcast is being recorded and released on the second day of 2023. So Happy New Year, everybody. I think that 2023 is going to be a great year. I'm looking forward. We got a legislative session coming up, so I'll find myself in Austin, always looking for some more great Texas history stories. I hope you had a wonderful holiday season and are starting 2023 with a bang. I want to put a bug in your ear for the upcoming Texas State Historical Association annual meeting in El Paso. It's March 2nd through 4th. So go to tshaonline.org and check it out. The TSHA annual meeting is always a great chance to gather and mingle with fellow Texas history lovers from all over the country. So give that a look. El Paso, of course, a very beautiful, very historic place and a very interesting place for this year's annual meeting. Speaking of interesting, today I want to tell you a story about a lady, and I didn't know really anything about her. Stumbled onto a story about her, and it turns out she's another one of those little-known Texas history characters that have had very interesting lives. So I want to tell you about that. Her name was Osjetea Briggs. Now, Osjetea is spelled Osjetea. It's a Choctaw word, which means falling star. Osjetea was born in Groesbeck in Limestone County in 1917. And I'm going to use her first name, Osjetea, rather than Ms. Briggs, because it's beautiful, and it's a beautiful word, and it sets her apart. Osjetea was of Choctaw, Cherokee, and Kickapoo descent, and was very proud of her native heritage. More specifically, her grandfather was a member of the Kickapoo Choctaw tribe, which was a subset, according to her, of the larger Kickapoo Indian tribe, sort of like in some of the Indian trial episodes we talked about the difference between Kiowas and Kiowa Apaches. So also, Osjetea was cousins with the Plummer family. Now, this is where we get into something that shows you just how complicated Texas history can be. Rachel Plummer was captured in the same Comanche raid where Cynthia Ann Parker was captured at Fort Parker in May of 1836. Rachel and Cynthia were cousins, so Osjetea was also a cousin to Cynthia Ann Parker, although a little bit detached. Osjeeta's older siblings, her mother and all her cousins, went to what was called the Kickapoo School. Osjetea, though, did not. She went to public schools. She won her first essay contest in 7th grade, writing extemporaneously with no research and no preparation on George Washington. She loved history and obviously was a good writer. That win inspired her to continue entering the contest throughout high school. In her own words, Osjetea said, quote, "I always wrote better than I did anything else, but I never followed it as a profession until I came to Anderson County," close quote. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story. Osjetea grew up, like so many did, in rural Texas in the early 1900s, largely self-sufficient. Osjetea describes it this way, quote, "There was no money. That was not bad, and looking back, it wasn't even bad to us then. We just learned to endure," close quote. I think that's a great way to look at it. She claimed she grew up, they raised some animals, and among them some hogs, and she claimed never to eat hog meat because she had named all the hogs on the farm and considered them personal friends. Now, the lesson there, as I learned from my rural part of my family, is don't ever name the animals. But one day, her mother bought sliced bacon at the grocery store because pre-sliced bacon back then was such a novelty. Her mother thought she had to have some. Osjetea ate that bacon because her mother assured her it wasn't anyone she knew. For school supplies, as she was growing up, Osjetea and her siblings would take a dozen eggs, sell them for 10 cents, buy a Big Chief tablet for a nickel, and a pencil for another nickel. In other words, Osjetea and her siblings did without food without breakfast so they could have school supplies. That's how seriously they took their education. There was honor in an education. The kids didn't want to go to school to play sports or be cheerleaders or anything like that. They went to school to work. Osjetea describes one of her grandfathers, a Choctaw, telling his children, which included Osjeeta's mother, that the children of that time had gone to pot. Now, this would have been a grandfather speaking in the late 19th century. The children of the time had gone to pot, and that only education could save them. He also threatened his kids, including Osjeeta's mother, that if anyone brought any shame on the family or tribe, Grandpa would personally take him to the woods and kill him with a bow and arrow. And it made an impression. The mother claimed, Osjeeta's mother told Osjeeta that they never did put him to the test because they just weren't sure. Osjeeta said this, quote, "You may not have anything to eat, but you have much honor," close quote. And I'm putting these quotes in here hopefully to make an impression and get you thinking and comparing those times to these. One other mildly amusing thing about her youth was that the family kept the hogs in the area under their house. That was the hog pen. Her older brother had the great idea to move the hogs under the house, put chicken wire around it, and he invented, essentially, the garbage disposal. Her older brother drilled a hole in the kitchen floor and installed a funnel, so all you had to do was pour the slop in the funnel. It went under the house. Hogs were fed. No problem. He did it so his mother wouldn't have to walk out to the hog pen carrying a 5-gallon bucket of slop. Well, Osjeeta gave an interview one time where she told a funny story that in those days, the school nurse would travel around the community and inspect the conditions in which the children were living to make sure everything was okay, etc. The actual nurse that worked for the school did that. She came to Osjeeta's house and was sitting in the kitchen when the pigs erupted and started squealing for food. And if you've ever heard hungry hogs start to make noise, they kind of half grunt, half squeal. And the lady apparently shot straight up out of her chair, scared to death. Osjeeta's mother, of course, since the school nurse was there, was trying to make a good impression. But her brother had no qualms about bragging about the fact that the hogs were under the house. The nurse commented that it wasn't healthy, to which Osjeeta's mother said, quote, "Oh no, we haven't lost a hog yet," close quote. So Osjeeta grew up tough, and it turns out that she would need it. She graduated high school in Groesbeck and worked as a film retoucher, first in Dallas and then in Houston. Now, that's not an occupation you hear a lot about in these digital days, but film retouching was an art unto itself. She also took an unpaid position as the associate editor of the Houstonian newspaper, which is the student newspaper at Sam Houston State. In fact, Dan Rather was the editor of that paper during his time at Sam Houston. So Osjeeta was working in both photography and writing. But early on in her adult life, she ran into a situation that would severely test her character. While working in Dallas, she was working in a photography studio, and she met a man, as a retoucher, as I mentioned, met a man named J.W. Stokes. He became enamored with Osjeeta, to say the least, so enamored that he started stalking her. Now, this is 1938, and they didn't use the term stalker then, but Stokes was a stalker. Osjeeta wasn't interested, so that just made it worse. And she was so nervous about things and so unable to control the situation, as so often happens, unfortunately. She quit her job in Dallas and moved to Houston. That did not deter Stokes. He would follow her from one town to another, as Osjeeta described it. She landed in Houston, began working at that photography studio in Houston, and also editing the paper I mentioned before. And this situation had created such a problem that Stokes' wife was attempting to divorce him. So on Osjeeta's 21st birthday in December of 1938, she went downstairs from her apartment to pick up a birthday cake for the party she was hosting for her birthday and some friends in her apartment. She walks into the drugstore, and there stands Stokes. Flustered, obviously, she gets the cake, she goes upstairs. Stokes follows her. And unbeknownst to her, she is lighting the candles on the birthday cake, and Stokes starts banging on the door. 21-year-old Osjetea, scared for her life, grabs a pistol, shoots Stokes twice, which is a heck of a situation to be in on your 21st birthday. Stokes is taken to a hospital. His estranged wife at his bedside. Stokes succumbs to his injuries and dies that night. The police arrested Osjetea for murder, but the grand jury recognized the situation and issued a no bill, which means no charges were filed against her, and she was free to go. So at a fairly young age, Osjetea had had an interesting and somewhat tumultuous life already. But demonstrating her strength of character, it did not deter her. She took up photography, traveling all over the world during the 40s, taking pictures. She won several awards and became known around the world as a photographer. But that's not all. She also painted portraits. She decided to move at some point during her photography career to Palestine, Texas, in Anderson County. And she set up a photography studio there. The story goes that in Reagan Park in Palestine, Osjetea liked the John Reagan monument that stands in that park. John Reagan was one of the early leaders of the Democratic Party in Texas and was Postmaster General of the Confederacy. She became interested in Reagan and decided to paint his portrait. So she became a portrait painter. She painted 3 portraits, one that went into the federal building in Anderson County and 2 that were in a museum. But she didn't stop there. She painted a portrait of Texas Governor Thomas Campbell. She painted a portrait of Sam Houston. She also painted a portrait of Robert E. Lee. So she was certainly a woman of many talents. But recall the quote I read for you earlier, where she felt herself a better writer than anything else. Well, one day when she was in Palestine, the editor of a weekly newspaper was talking to her and suggested that she go to Elkhart, Texas. Now, Elkhart is not too far away from Palestine, down 287. He suggested, why don't you go to Elkhart and do a newspaper in that community, because there wasn't a newspaper at the time. Osjetea was doubting her ability to do this, probably for the first time in her life, but the editor that she was talking to offered to print the paper for her. In an interview she gave late in her life, she said she felt very insecure because she didn't have a journalism degree, to which this editor replied, quote, "Who cares about a degree in journalism? Who will know the difference?" Close quote, which I think is a wonderful quote. Think about that one in current times. So in 1963, 1964, and 1965, she published the Elkhart Eagle. Osjetea recalls that one of the things that taught her, the paper became really successful, and she got invited to speak to the Texas Press Association several times, which scared her to death. But she remembers that one of the great lessons she learned during that time was how to speak in front of people, even though she lost money. She had a great quote that I think will set the tone for many of us for 2023. Here's what she said: "Money can be replaced, but that paper gave me experience." I think that's important for all of us to remember. The office of the Elkhart Eagle, by the way, was the corner table of a little restaurant in Elkhart, where they ran a telephone line over there and let her use the table as her desk and put her typewriter on. Well, something else came out of that. Osjetea began writing a column in her weekly called, quote, "Walk in My Moccasins," close quote. And she won state, national, and international awards for that column. Now, I think about the time period and the civil rights time period, and here you have an entrepreneurial female Native American publishing a paper all on her own in a small East Texas town. That was significant, but that isn't enough. The column had to be quality, which it was. She was a great writer. Here's what she says about a writer, or about her writing, also a good lesson for us all. Quote, "But I wrote simply. If I couldn't spell a word, I didn't use it," close quote. That's some of the best writing advice I think I've ever heard. Osjetea also became involved in politics. She was always a delegate to her local political conventions. And of course, at this time in East Texas, that was all the Democratic conventions. At one convention in the 60s, she was talking to none other than Lyndon Johnson. And she tells a funny story that Lyndon Johnson at that time wore rimless glasses, and she thought they looked terrible. But she also noticed that when the press came around, that he would snatch those glasses off because he knew they weren't very becoming. And so the press started to walk up, and they were talking in the convention hall, and she says, "Here comes the press. You better take your glasses off." So he grabs them, he snatches them off and hands them to her. And Johnson's a senator at this time. So they have a little press gaggle there with Lyndon Johnson, and when the press leaves, Osjetea takes the glasses, wipes them on her skirt to clean them, hands them back, and said, these glasses are not good looking on you. You really ought to get some horn-rimmed glasses because it'll make you look smarter. Osjetea, by the way, did not agree with Lyndon Johnson on darn near anything. Well, apparently that offended LBJ, and so he said, in response to her glasses comment, said, "Why don't you get your braids cut off?" Because she wore the long Native American braids. Well, that set Osjetea off. She stomps off toward the refreshment table to a lawyer that she knew that was standing there, who happened to be standing there with none other than John Connally. And so she's formally introduced to John Connally, and the first words out of her mouth are, according to her, quote, "Mr. Connally, why don't you get you another job and quit being Lyndon Johnson's poodle dog," close quote. So Osjetea must have been really mad. And Connally, of course, didn't think she was serious, but she claims to have told him, "If you run for governor, I will shake every bush in East Texas for you." I need to go back. I made a mistake. This was in the 50s, not the 60s, but so it was early in Johnson's career. Well, Connally did eventually run for governor. And the first call he made for East Texas was Osjetea Briggs. Osjetea claims LBJ never did forgive her for the glasses comment, but that would hold true to LBJ's personality, probably. Osjetea wasn't done with politics, however. In 1966, she filed to run against the incumbent state representative for District 16, which was Anderson and Cherokee County in those days. Unsuccessful, but fearless. So Osjetea Briggs had an interesting life. Born a poor Native American girl in eastern Texas, growing up hard, facing adversity, including a violent episode late in her life. She went on to become world-renowned as a photographer, an artist, a newspaper publisher, and a writer. She left an interview again late in her life with a few quotes that I want to read to you. One says the following, quote, "This is what's wrong with our world now. And children have too much too soon," close quote. Osjetea would certainly know. She also described herself thusly, quote, "I've been old all my life," close quote. Osjetea Briggs was a great Texan. Now we come to the part of the episode I call Getting There, where I tell you how to see some of the things I describe in the episode. This episode doesn't really lend itself too much to that, but Osjetea died in 2002 at the age of 84. She is buried in the Falconberry Cemetery in Groesbeck, Texas. That's east on Highway 164, south side of the road, the Falconberry Cemetery. There's also a book that was published, a collection of her columns. The book is titled Walk in My Moccasins, which is the title of her column, and it's a very interesting read. Osjetea was an honest writer, a direct writer, and a good writer. And that's available. It's out of print, but it's available if you just do a little looking. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. As I've mentioned several times, 2023 is the bicentennial year of the Texas Rangers, so get ready for some Texas Rangers episodes throughout the year. Follow us on social media at Wise About Texas, Twitter and Instagram, Wise About Texas Facebook page. If you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. I'm going to be spending some time in Austin during the legislative session. If you're around Austin, if you're coming to Austin, it's a great time to come and see your Capitol, meet your representatives, and watch the process at work. Shoot me an email, host@wiseabouttexas.com. Maybe we can meet in the Capitol. Thanks again for tuning in to Wise About Texas. Go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.